What's up, everyone? Welcome to Back to the Future, the podcast that takes a trip down Philly sports memory lane and asks the question, what if? I'm your host, Jim Montgomery. Follow me on Twitter and TikTok at Jimbo_Mont. Be sure to check out our YouTube channel for This Day in Philly Sports History, which is a quick 2 to 5 minute little breakdown of important games or events in Philadelphia sports history. Before I get into tonight's pod, I did want to take a minute and send my condolences and just kind of reflect a little bit. Found out this morning that yesterday, Reverend Herb Lusk, Pastor Lusk, as I knew him, passed away of cancer at the age of 69. There's a sports tie-in with that I'll get to in a minute, but I was blessed to have worked for him at the People for People Charter School for 9 years. It's where I got my first job as an educator. So many good memories. He was just an awesome guy to talk to. Just always looking out for everybody. He wasn't around as much because he was basically running the whole organization. He was the pastor at the Greater Exodus Baptist Church there on Broad Street, if you're familiar with the Fairmount area. Just did so much for that community in general. And I'll be forever grateful for having the opportunity to work for that organization. The sports tie-in with that is he actually was a running back for the Eagles, drafted by Dick Vermeil in 1976. Played 3 years, then retired to pursue the ministry and all of the charitable and good services that he provided over the years. What he probably is most remembered for on the sports field was, and I remember this was big, not so much now, but when I was a kid, there was a ton of athletes after they would score a touchdown or do something. I know Reggie White was big on this at the end of the game, doing the prayer circles, but Pastor Lusk was the first one to actually kneel in the end zone after he scored a touchdown. Just because his story was, and I heard him he told me sitting in his office there at 800 North Broad, and he told me, he was like, look, he said, I was injured his knee coming out of college, and he didn't know if he was going to make it or not. So for him, if he did make it and was able to be successful and score a touchdown, was all due to God. So that was his way of celebrating and giving thanks to God for allowing him to battle back from that injury. So I want to send my condolences to the Lusk family. Anybody still anybody, I should say, at the People for People organization, especially those that I had the privilege of working with. I'm still friends with a ton of people on Facebook, and definitely was very sad and devastating news to hear that. So just make sure you say a prayer for the Lusk family, the People for People organization. We lost a great man who did a lot. Thank you, Pastor Lusk. God bless, and prayers and condolences to you and your family. All right, so moving into the podcast tonight, I wish I could maybe start on a more upbeat note after that, but unfortunately it's September, and that generally means a lot of times the Phillies, at least in recent history, Phillies are about to go on a slide. So heading into tonight, they were 2.5 games up of the Brewers for the third wild card spot after getting swept by the Braves last weekend. And I forget who they even played at this point now, but they had lost the last game of that series. So they came into tonight on a 4-game losing streak, and coming home from soccer practice, said, all right, game just started, turned it on. They were already down 3-0. By the time we got from the soccer fields back home, it was 4. I haven't even checked. They might be down more than that. So all of that to say, originally, this was supposed to be something that I was going to take, and we talked a little bit about the curse of Billy Penn, or not a little bit, a lot of it about the curse of Billy Penn last week. And I figured, you know what? The superstitious thing, let's just hit it head on. Maybe let's just talk about the Phillies and their their September swoons, and maybe it'll reverse the curse or reverse the slide they're on. I mean, a lot of those teams in the early 2000s, like think Larry Bowa, Scott Rowland, those teams, they seem to be in the wild card or the division race really till right about this week, maybe last week or so, but right about now, and then they would just kind of fall apart and let the Mets or the Braves or whoever overtake them for either the division lead, the wild card spot, whatever it could be. Last year, I didn't even realize this until this week. They were only a half a game back of the Braves, who would go on to win the World Series. And I mean, we talked a little bit about the 2011 team and how they won 102 games and then just completely collapsed through September. All of these, by the way, are things that we've talked about the past couple of weeks on This Day in Philly Sports. So if you're not listening, you're missing out. But when it comes to September slides and September swoons, I think the worst of all would happen in 1964. So today we're going to take a look at the 1964 Phillies. I know some of you out there might not even have parents who were born then. For somebody like me, my parents were very young still at that time. And yes, it was 57 years ago, but this week is sort of when that slide, or as I think sometimes they call it, the fold with a PH, that it happened. And if you are a loyal listener to This Day in Philly Sports History, I touched on this today. September 20th, 1964 was that team's last win in the month of September. So that's why I'm tying it all in right now. It's relevant to what's going on in current events and our team now, who, like I said, it's probably worse than 4-0 than the last time I heard, but we'll see. Hopefully they can kind of pull together and get it out. But by many people, and especially Philadelphia faithful, this collapse in 1964 is hands down the single worst. I can't even say moment because it lasted for so long and so many games, but the single worst just feeling of a lot of fans and a lot of people in the city. Just, I kind of picture it as take some of the worst feelings I've had over my years, and I've touched on a few of them. I'm going to be touching on them a lot. The Eagles, especially in the book, and multiply it by 1,000,000, and that's how a lot of people feel about that. So a little background on that team for some of you guys who aren't that familiar with what kind of led up to that. I know a lot of people know about the 1964 collapse, but sometimes they don't know the background to it. So the year before, the Phillies finished in fourth place. They were like 10 games over 500. Now back then there was only like 10 teams, I think, or 12 teams. So fourth place wasn't that bad of a finish. They were 12 games back of the Dodgers, who ultimately ended up winning the World Series that year, beating the Yankees. But the Phillies beat the Dodgers 11 out of 18 times that year, which isn't too bad for a team that has historically, the Phillies, the entire organization, it's probably, unfortunately, one of the worst, if not the worst, sports franchise in the history of sports. And I would probably be willing to take that, not something I'm proud of, but if you take that worldwide and get into like some of the soccer leagues, the Premier League soccer, or a lot of the leagues in Spain, and I guarantee you they're probably worse than a lot of those teams. So to be able to beat the champs, finish in fourth place, over 500, kind of showed some promise. And that going into that 1964 season, there was a lot of promise for that team. They had some solid pitching. They were very solid on offense. They had picked up, I think it was that year, was the first year they picked up Robin Roberts, who his number is retired at Citizens Bank Park. If you go, next time you're at a game, look for it. He was number 36. I'm sorry, not Robin Roberts. It was Jim Bunning. Have my people mixed up there. But Jim Bunning, they had picked up going into that season, which I don't know if his number is retired or not. I probably should know that. But Anyway, and to added him to an already solid pitching staff. And they had some good offense. They had a rookie coming in, Richie Allen, Dick Allen, who I always knew him as, and who later in his career, but back then he was Richie Allen. So there's definitely a lot of promise and a lot of high hopes, to borrow Harry Call's term, for the team that year. And I even looked back through some of the old newspaper clippings from the Daily News, and I didn't necessarily find the Major League Baseball preview that maybe the Daily News or the Inquirer would put together today. But I was able to kind of piece through and look through some of the articles leading up to opening day. And I read through some of the things coming in from spring training just to see sort of what the vibe was in the city. Because nowadays sports, because of social media, because of the internet, 24-hour news cycle, all of that, we're very connected with our sports teams. Back then, everybody relied on those newspapers. So I was like, oh, if anybody's going to give an honest opinion on there, it would be the newspaper writers of the day. From what I could gather, and just the way things were going in spring training, they were kind of expected to be back in that top four, one of those top four teams in the National League. And if they continued to improve, a lot of the young guys, if Jim Bunning ended up being a good fit for them, if Dick Allen, or Richie Allen as they called him back then, if he progressed the way and kind of made the splash that they thought he would, they could kind of push the Dodgers and the Cardinals, and I believe the Giants were sort of the other team. The Reds were up there too, kind of push those teams as one of the top teams in the National League. And again, it was different today, or back then, than it is today, because there was only 10 or 12 teams in the league. So if you won the league, you automatically were going to the World Series. So there's no interleague play. For some of you younger listeners out there, the only time the American and the National League played each other was the All-Star game and the World Series. So basically, you had to come in first place in your division, which if you have a team that has good, solid young pitching, good, solid young offensive talent, you could catch that lightning in a bottle and finish in first place and sneak into the World Series over the course of a year, just like the 93 Phillies did. I mean, nobody expected them to do that, and they were able to do it. And who's to say they couldn't do that? And like I said, what I gathered from some of the articles from the Daily News and the Inquirer were that the belief was that they could potentially do this. So season started. Sure enough, they get off to a hot start, win 8 of their first 10 games or something crazy like that. And then as the season progressed, they were battling. They were in or at the near first place. I think it may have been like 2 or 3 games out of first place at one point during the summer. But it was basically them and the Giants kind of battling back and forth. And going into the All-Star game, I mean, everything was breaking the way they thought it would be. Johnny Callison was their best offensive player. He was having an MVP season, and heading into July, he was the odds-on favorite to win the MVP. He won the All-Star game MVP. Excuse me. So things were looking good there. Dick Allen, and I know he was Richie Allen back then, but I'm just going to call him Dick Allen because that's just how I know him as. But he exceeded the expectations, or met them, however you want to put it, and was the favorite to win the Rookie of the Year in 1964, which he did. He just was putting up numbers and doing whatever he could. Jim Bunning was a nice fit into that that pitching staff. I think the other guy, their ace coming into that season was Chris Short, I believe the guy's name was, and from what I read, he was never necessarily 100% comfortable in that number one role. So Jim Bunning came in, was able to take over that number one pitcher role, and allowed Chris Short then to completely and utterly just explode and excel in that second pitching spot. So everything was breaking the way it should that way. Jim Bunning threw a perfect game on Father's Day against the Mets at Shea Stadium. I mean, back then, it was the first one in the National League since 1880. And yes, I did do the research on this. And it was only the fifth one of the quote unquote World Series era where everybody played like under similar rules. The ones that were thrown in the 1800s were, I think they were saying their pitchers were throwing underhand, the mound was closer. It was just crazy. So to throw a perfect game, and there's only been, I believe, 21 all time anyway. So needless to say, it's a special season that was kind of going on for the Phillies in 1964. You had potentially the MVP of the league. You had the All-Star MVP. You had Bunning, who was a Cy Young candidate at the time. You had Dick Allen, who was going to be the Rookie of the Year. You have guys throwing perfect games, and everything is breaking the way everybody thought it would. The Dodgers weren't necessarily coming, like whether they had a World Series championship hangover, whatever it was. It just was something special was going on. And as I kind of talked with some family members and just have done my own research over the years, I know for a fact that pennant fever was sweeping through the city come like August. They call them the dog days of summer. And everybody in Philly was excited because of just how fun and good that team. And to me, it kind of hit home because I've talked to my dad over the years about this. And when different teams in the city get hot and everybody follows them, like the Sixers in '01 or the Phillies when they went on their run, especially in '08, the '93 Phillies, the Eagles when they won to the Super Bowl. Like he said, it was like that. I mean, obviously it was different because of just the way society was back then, but everybody was excited. I mean, he was super, super ready as a kid, ready to see the Phillies finally go to the World Series for the first time in his life. So throughout August, they started pulling away. And they ended the month and opened September with a 5.5 game lead over the Reds. And I guess I would say at this point, this wouldn't have been the way things go. But because we've been so conditioned as Philly fans over the year, things look good until they weren't. So TV Guide. And for those of you who don't know what TV Guide is, back in the dark ages before remote controls and before smart TVs and talking into your remote and things like that, when you used to have to, get up and change the channel by hand and turn the dial. And there was only like 3, 4, 5 channels maybe. Back in the 60s, I guess there was only 3. You had to buy, there was a little magazine, a TV Guide. Everybody had it where it told you what was on for the week. There's no button or guide channel or whatever on the Xfinity box or Fios or Roku, whatever you're using. You had to actually read a magazine and tell you. So TV Guide took a picture of Connie Mack Stadium, which was the stadium the Phillies played in, for their World Series preview issue, because everything at that point, the end of August, beginning of September, looked as though it was going to be the Yankees and the Phillies. I mean, both teams had pretty sizable leads with not that many games left, and nobody had really ever come back from that big of a deficit and just the way they were playing. So, again, things were looking good until they weren't. Injuries started to kind of mount up a little bit, which, I mean, that happens. It's a long season. Then bad luck. They had guys that made silly errors or got lucky bounces, lucky hits. But the momentum slowed a little bit, which, again, if you're playing at that high of a level, that makes sense. But they still had a 6.5 game lead after they beat the Dodgers on September 20th, 1964. And I'll give a nice little plug here. If you listen to This Day in Philly sports history, you already knew that, and you already knew what was coming for the podcast tonight. So make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. But so after beating the Dodgers out in LA, they came home to start a 7-game homestand. And these numbers are just unfathomable to me. They were up 6.5 games with 12 to play. All right. Their lead was over the Reds. The Reds were the second place team. First 3 games they play on that homestand were against the Red. If they swept them, they win the pennant. No questions asked. And even if they don't sweep them, I mean, they're down to just needing like two more wins. Things are good. So they open up play September 21st, 1964. Scoreless first 6 innings against the Reds. So then the Reds come up to bat in the 7th. Chico Ruiz hits a single. Only reason I know that name and I'm throwing that name out there is because it's important. It's going to come back, and that name has been ingrained in my brain. So next batter, I forget who that was. Hit a line drive up the middle. Tried to stretch it into a double. Got thrown at second. Chico Ruiz moved to third. Again, that detail is important. Then Frank Robinson. Yes, that Frank Robinson, the guy that used to play for the Orioles, managed the Orioles. I think he managed the Nationals at some point. Hall of Famer. One of the best hitters, power hitters especially, of all time, came to bat, swung and missed the first pitch badly. And Ruiz, on third base, noticed something. The Phillies pitcher that day was Art Mahaffrey. And I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, and Ruiz noticed, you know what? This dude is not necessarily paying any attention to me. I got an idea. So Ruiz never really tug up after that swing and a miss. Mahaffrey came by, delivered the next pitch. Ruiz broke for home, scared the crap apparently out of Mahaffrey, who threw a wild pitch off the back screen at Connie Mack Stadium. Chico Ruiz stole home. Only run of the game. Phillies lose 1-0. Not necessarily that big of a deal to lose that, especially with a 6.5 game lead with now, or a 5.5 game lead now with 11 to play. So you got some time. You got some wiggle room to play around with. Until you don't. They would go on to lose their next 9 games. So that 6.5 game lead with 12 games left to play vanished very quickly. I wouldn't even say quickly. Knowing just from the stories I've heard from my dad and other my friends' dads and other my family members who were around for that, and just knowing it took forever. So they ended up winning their last 2 games in October. Woohoo! But they still finished 1 game back of the Cardinals, who ended up winning the National League pennant. This whole season and collapse has been ingrained in my head from the time I was old enough to talk sports with my dad. I don't know how many times I've heard, yeah, but don't forget what happened to the 1964 Phillies, or yeah, but Chico Ruiz, they were up 6.5 games with 12 to play. So it's sort of one of those things. Hopefully you see where I'm going with this. For guys my dad's generation, this whole collapse was Randall's knee injury, the fog ball, the whole Andy Reid NFC Championship game misses, the 2010 and 2011 Phillies team, all wrapped into one, but worse. My dad for this season was 9 years old, and I know as a 9-year-old how those Buddy Ryan teams affected me. Baseball was king back then. Yes, football was popular, but everything revolved around baseball back then. So for guys my dad's age and from that generation, it just gave them a negative vibe about all things Philly sports. And remember, this is still 4 years before the whole O.J. Simpson draft and booing Santa and throwing snowballs at Santa's happened. And like I needed to give you more proof of why Philly fans are the way they are. I mean, they were already cynical by the time they booed Santa Claus, but nobody talks about that. Well, you threw snowballs at Santa. No, they were cynical from the 1964 team way, way before they threw snowballs at Santa. But I just remember as a kid, all the grown-ups in my family, my grandmom included, but she did have that soft spot for Mike Schmidt in her heart. Love you, Betty Lou. But they would always talk about the 70s and 80s Phillies with those same kind of negative, just, they're going to blow it. They blew it in 76. They blew it in 77. They got lucky. They should have blown it in 1980, the year they won it. It was always the negative connotation to it. And that whole idea of they'll blow it My dad, I always remember him saying, they'll blow it. Don't worry. They'll figure out a way to blow it. I mean, I think deep down I had to stop talking to him a little bit during the Phillies 2008 run because I think he didn't want them to. And I don't think he necessarily thought, but I think we were all just so, I kind of thought it too, but we are all just so conditioned that, oh, they're going to blow it. And I mean, think about that whole 2008 team. The way that whole thing played out, they had the game won, then the umpires didn't call it, and then there was a question about the rule, then they let them play. All of a sudden Tampa Bay tied it up, and now we got to wait 2 more days. So I think deep down we were all like, okay, this is where we blow it. Luckily they don't. So just obviously this is the worst collapse in Philly sports history. I can't necessarily think of anything worse in Philadelphia. I've tried, and even the ones I could come up with, they were like single games. This was all over the course of 2 weeks. And I didn't do any research on this, so I'm sure there's some obscure, maybe NHL or college basketball or college football, something that maybe I'm missing. But again, all of these that came to my mind were one game. This was over the course of 2 weeks. Like, imagine that pain and suffering for 2 weeks, especially for somebody like my dad who was just super excited about it. And the Phillies are just ripping his heart out, but not just in one like full swoop. They're just picking it apart. And I just couldn't imagine. So the ones I came up with, I mean, the Falcons blowing the 28-3 lead in the second half in the Super Bowl against the Patriots. That's probably the closest I could come just because of the magnitude of that game. For my money, the biggest choke job ever was probably the Houston Oilers blowing that wild card game against the Bills in '92. But again, they ended up going. That was a wild card game, and the Bills went to the Super Bowl, so it's not the magnitude quite wasn't there. In Philly, luckily we were on one of the opposite ends where the Bruins blew the 3-0 series lead, then blew the 3-0 lead in Game 7 to the Flyers in 2010. The Yankees blew a 3-0 lead in the ALCS to the Red Sox to end their curse, which no better way to blow a curse or break a curse than going and coming back from a 3-0 deficit. But Greg Norman had probably the ultimate choke job in golf in '96 at the Masters. The '86 Red Sox might be up there only because the whole Bill Buckner thing could have been avoided. They just didn't make the defensive switch. Got to throw the 2007 Mets in there just because, well, they're the Mets, and I had to. And honestly, to talk about the Mets choke kind of makes me feel a little bit better. Love you all, my Mets fans. But, so for today, I think, I mean, the what if is, what if they didn't go into the tailspin after Chico Ruiz stole home? And I did hear some article or interviews with some of the players after that. And I know Dick Allen had mentioned this, that it kind of just, for whatever reason, because they were just so, there was just so many things bad luck wise that were happening leading into that play broke their back. And for whatever reason, they just could never recover from that. I don't think they expected to lose 10 games in a row after that. But I think what happened is it was just sort of like it just kept going and going and going. And it just sort of got in their minds that they just were like, all right, we're going to blow this. And so like Chico Ruiz, I will never forget that name because, one, it's been so ingrained in my head, but because of how much I've heard about Chico Ruiz and how everything's compared to that collapse of 1964, he's on my Mount Rushmore of Philly villains of pre my fandom. So anything like pre late 80s, because obviously I can give you a whole laundry. I can fill up 10 Mount Rushmores of Philly villains after that, but you got to have him. Chico Ruiz is on there. Kenny King. Sorry, Kenny. Good friends with Kenny King Jr., but man, he killed the Eagles in the Super Bowl that year. And then the others are just teams. The Lakers, Celtics, Dodgers, take your pick. Yeah, I know it's a cop out because it's not players, it's teams, but it's my list, my Mount Rushmore. I make the rules. So, but maybe there's somebody I miss. I don't know. These are just the people I remember hearing about. And the I guess to me the frustrating part, and like I said, Dick Allen had mentioned that just got inside their heads and they just never recovered. But I mean, if you could have just like for what if purposes here, even if they had gone 500, like 6-6 in those last 12 games, they win the division or the pennant. They go 4-6, maybe even 3-7, they still win this pennant. But again, it just snowballed. Like once they lost one, then two, then three, and just like how everybody says winning's contagious. Once you win a couple, you kind of just you feel good and you have confidence. The opposite is true for losing. Once you start losing, I think this is what happened to that team. They just knew they were going to go out and find a way to lose. And could they have beaten the Yankees? Why not? The Cardinals did it in 7 games. Sure, they had to get hot to make it to the World Series, but it's not like this was the 1920 Yankees. This was I guess if you want to call it that, a downtime in the Yankees championship run. They had last won it in 62 and they wouldn't win another one until 77. So it definitely was on the table for them to do it. I think the bigger impact of them, even if they didn't beat the Yankees, the bigger impact for them would have been just on the psyche of the team. Because after that, the team steadily declined after that. And they just various different things. Players got old, players got traded, players got in trouble. Whatever. Don't want to necessarily get into all the details, just that they had steadily declined and then to the point where they were rock bottom and they never got back to the postseason until 76. But all of a sudden you don't choke, and maybe some of those players like they stay in Philly, or maybe people want to come to Philly to play. Like that's a way. Maybe I don't know. It just changes your whole outlook on things, and it's the shot in the arm they need it. And maybe they're one of the fourth team that goes with the Giants, the Cardinals, and the Dodgers in the late 60s. I mean, those teams were good. The Reds were almost getting ready to go up there too. You have the random Mets in the late 60s, but who knows? You just like one World Series appearance and maybe things change. And I think the guys from my dad's generation, they're different. They're probably not going to be as negative. Maybe they don't boo Santa Claus after the 68 season because they're still 4 years away or removed from a World Series. But if you think about the collapse, you think about the 68 Eagles season when they were all ready to get the number 1 pick and then didn't. Then go into the early 70s when all the teams blow. The Sixers turned into the worst team ever, winning 9 games in a season. And just 5 years older, they won the title. So things started just spiraling out of control after that 64 team of the Phillies collapsed. And I mean, I guess I'd be cynical too if that was what I grew up and what I know. And I mean, I'm still shaped somewhat by those Buddy Ryan teams and those jobs that they had. Maybe the Philly fans, if the Phillies didn't collapse, maybe they don't get the bad rep. And yes, I'm not sorry. I'm always going to look for a way to pump us up as Philly fans or make excuses, whatever you want to call it. That's for you to decide. But point is, they have reason to be miserable. Did you hear anything bad happening at the Eagles game last night after they won? No, because the team played amazing and looked great. So you just compound all of these negative things happening to them. Like the Charlie or Lucy taking the ball from Charlie Brown right before he's going to kick it. Yeah, you're going to be pissed off. Yeah, you're going to be cynical. Yeah, you're going to boo Santa Claus, especially if it's a shitty Santa. But anyway, it took until 1980 for the Phillies to finally break the curse of Chico Ruiz, I guess. Long term and looking at it from on a wide view, I don't think it was necessarily Chico Ruiz that had that curse because 1980 was the first time they had won, and they've been playing baseball since 1883. But that's, again, it goes back into the whole worst team in the history of professional sports conversation. But we'll see. The curse being broken was very short lived because we talked about Billy Penn in the last episode. So it had a good, like, not even 10-year run. But anyway, is this the worst collapse? Well, it's definitely the worst collapse in Philly sports history. Is there a collapse that's worse in any major sport? Let me know. Shoot me a message, whatever you want to do. But make sure you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. Check me out on Twitter and TikTok, Jimbo_Mont. Subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can get an inside look at the today in Philadelphia sports history. I have them up by 8 a.m. every day. I do have some other things in the next couple months I'm going to be rolling out too. So get in now so you don't miss anything. And until next time, this is Jim Montgomery saying, I'll see you when I see you.